I would like to introduce our speaker today, Brian Schlafly. Brian has been with the Master Gardeners, it seems like for a long time, but one of our newest members. Brian, we can see your slide. You're all set.
Okay.
And so always appreciative of the information that Brian shares. So Brian, thank you for taking the time today, for being a part of this. And I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Yes, my name is Brian Schlafly, and I have been around the Master Gardeners for a while. My wife is a Master Gardener. She was of the class of 2011 when we lived in Jackson County, Oregon, and I've been palling behind her for 43 years or so, but with Master Gardeners since 2011 and put in a lot of volunteer time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my video. I'll just say hi, and then you won't be distracted by me, and you can be fully focused on the presentation today. So it is about compost today. Let's see if I can get this advanced here. There we go. So I've changed up the title of my presentation to be Alchemy and Composting, and to demystify and to simplify composting. People may wonder why this? Well, composting can be likened to alchemy because back in the medieval times, there were a group of people called alchemists who were trying to turn common substances into gold. And dictionary.com says that alchemy is any seemingly magical process of transforming or combining common substances, usually of little value, into a substance of great value. And they were preoccupied with seeing if they could turn lead into gold. Composting is an understood and natural process by which ordinary organic waste materials are combined and allowed to decompose into a rich soil amendment. So waste becomes black gold. Composting can kind of seem magical, and we'll look at some slides and pictures here pretty soon to kind of show you what I mean, but the science is understood. And it can seem complex and maybe daunting, and maybe that's keeping some of you from becoming composters. I'm not going to get too technical today. I hope to come from a practitioner's point of view and to encourage you to consider composting, and more about that in a minute. Here's a slide that kind of tells you or shows you some of the simple process, or at least a graphical process, not simple, but a graphical process of what happens in composting. If you're interested in getting more technical, there's a scad of material out there on the internet and in the library and even here at Extension. And I'm speaking from the office today at Extension, so I have a good internet connection. But as you can see here, here's just 4 different places where you can go to get more information and more technical information. As I said, I'm going to take it from a little more simplified approach, and we're going to look at how to turn kitchen waste and yard waste into a mulch and or a soil amendment for those of us who enjoy gardening. And you can see that here's my utility yard where I got just common materials from the yard and from the kitchen, and through the process of composting, or alchemy, kind of this process of turning something worthless into something that's got great value. Now, I'm going to be talking mostly about hot composting today, as opposed to cold composting. Cold composting is composting, but it's passive. You basically take a bunch of materials and you pile them up and you wait a great long time, a year or more, and just let nature take its course and it becomes compost. Hot composting is the process where you are actively involved in mixing and managing material to get the the end product of compost. So why bother to compost? Some of you may or may not be asking that. I'm thinking that you're interested in it because you're giving up an hour of precious sunshine today to sit through this presentation. But here's some things to be thinking about. Some of us are motivated by money, and composting saves money, because if you go down to a commercial outfit or a retail outfit and look at buying soil amendments, they can be quite expensive. And then kitchen and garden waste add to your garbage rates. And if they don't, they certainly add to the overall bill of having landfills out there, filling up with things that could otherwise be composted. Perhaps you're environmentally motivated, and composting is environmentally friendly because it helps to reduce the need for chemical fertilizers in your yard and garden, and it reduces methane gas emissions from landfills, and it lowers your carbon footprint. Maybe, especially in 2021, if you're on a well or if you're in a water area where the people who manage the water through your pipes say, hey, we want you to curtail or to reduce your irrigation, composting can certainly help you by saving on watering. I came across an interesting fact where if you had a soil analysis done and you were low in organic matter, if you were able to increase, or for every 1% of increase organic matter that you add to your soil analysis in a square or in a cubic foot of soil, you can add 1.5 quarts of plant available water to that soil just by upping the organic matter that you have in your soil. Then if you use it as a top mulch, it will help reduce the surface evaporation of water. Composting adds value to your garbage. This is the alchemy. You take stuff that's waste, you take it out of the waste stream and you turn it into something that's valuable. And I think it was the EPA has said that the average household has up to or more than 20% of your waste or your garbage in something that could be composted. And composting produces this valuable organic matter that reduces that waste going into your landfills or into a burn pile. And then I love this. Composting helps you to grow an amazing garden and yummy vegetables for really beautiful flowers. So what can be composted? Well, here's a very short list in this table where you have different things that can be composted: grass, manures, vegetable waste, garden trimmings, coffee grounds, and tea leaves. You'll notice that that's under the column of green, things that are of higher nitrogen. We'll get into that in a moment. And then wood chips or sawdust, grass hay, wheat straw, corn stalks, shredded newspaper. Those are things that are higher in carbon, and we'll talk about that too. And then other things that if you just had these things, for the most part, they'd compost pretty well if you just mixed them up and kept them moist and aerated them. And again, we'll talk about that. So we mentioned manure. So here's a rule of thumb. When you're using manures in your compost, be thinking about what kind of animal it came from. And simply put, if it's a predator species or a carnivore, something of that sort, you probably don't want to be using it in your compost. If it comes from something that is eaten by another animal or by a human, then you're certainly more safe, but you still want to check. So I know that llamas and chickens and alpacas, even manure from cows, all of these can be used. So here again is my utility yard. And here's what I composted a year ago, last October. We were getting towards the end of the growing season. Tomato plants had frosted, so we yanked them up. We had leaves in the yard and on the patio and in the driveway. The dahlias, we clipped them off and dug the tubers. And it hadn't quite gotten wet enough that I couldn't yet mow the grass. So here's just a picture of what things look like in my utility yard a year ago. Oh, and don't forget your kitchen scraps. We have a container underneath our sink that we keep a lid on it. Gets a little gross, so it's nice to have a lid. But you can see we capture avocado skins and apple peelings and the core of a red pepper, coffee filters. A lot of things go into those kitchen scraps and stay out of the garbage can. Here's a little secret that I'm a little reluctant to share just because it'll mean more competition for the grounds that are at Starbucks. But often at Starbucks, if you go into one of their restaurants or one of their kiosks at Safeway or something like that, they'll have a little metal garbage can out there, and they'll put bags of their spent coffee in there. It may be inside their filters, it may be just the little cubes or the little discs that they create when they do the espresso. But they'll have this, and this takes it out of their waste streams, and then it goes into our compost and becomes something valuable. Again, alchemy. And then I love this phrase by Tom Peterson. He was an appliance store owner back in the 60s. And I remember him saying on his commercials, and remember, free is a very good price. And you'll hear me saying that some later on. And I say it to my kids quite a bit because it's true. Unless, of course, it's a horse. There's no such thing as a cheap free horse. So you got to be a little careful. But there's certain things you don't want to compost. Here's our dog, Lassen. He happened to find one of the compost bins and decided it was a great place to take a nap while I was working on some other things. Clearly, we wouldn't compost him, but there's also things that we don't want to compost, perhaps because they create an odor and attract pests or vermin. So dairy products, bones, and meat scraps, even from fish, you want to be careful. Fats, and then other things that you want to be careful about because they may survive the composting process. I choose not to put in diseased or insect infested plants. We don't put in certain weed seeds or plant parts from certain really pesky weeds. For example, field bindweed. If you don't have your compost up at a high temperature for a long time, and I'm talking 150 degrees plus for 7 to 10 days or more, certain things can survive the composting process. And as you use that compost around the yard, you don't want to be sowing weed seeds out there and creating a bigger headache for yourself. You want to be careful about your pet wastes, whether it's dog or cat, and that includes your cat litter. And then if you've used any chemical pesticides, you probably want to be careful about using those in your compost bin as well, because the actual active ingredient might survive the composting process. I've got a lot of bracken fern on my property, and I found in getting ready for this talk this time around that bracken fern is probably something you don't want to be composting because according to the National Institute of Health and a couple other sources, there's a compound within bracken fern that can be carcinogenic or is a potential being carcinogenic to humans. So I choose not to use it. Bracken fern is toxic to cattle, and it can be allelopathic, or it can have a chemical effect in preventing other plants to grow in and around it as it is in a field or something like that. So enough on that, but you probably want to be a little careful on bracken fern. So we've talked about why and what. I want to talk about how to compost. And I hope not to get too technical and that you're still staying with me and you haven't jumped outside because the sunshine's more interesting than to talk this talk. But I like to think of composting as a three-legged stool. It needs air and it needs food, and that's carbon and nitrogen, and then it needs water. And we'll talk about each of these things. Air, there is a anaerobic process that can take place within composting, and that's composting in the absence of air, but it gets stinky. That's where it starts smelling. It's not very effective, and your pile's not going to be thriving as it should. So it's going to need to have air, which means that you're probably going to need to aerate it. You're going to need to turn it, fork it, add some kind of vertical breathing tubes like a perforated pipe or something like that to keep air going into your pile. It also needs water, but you don't want to have too much. You don't want to drown your pile. And like this summer, it would have been pretty easy to have too little because it was hot and dry. And even inside your compost pile, it can become pretty dry. So think about it. People say if you took a sponge and you got it wet and then you wrung it out and it's still moist, but it's not dripping, it's kind of what you want. Obviously, you're probably not going to do that with your pile, but the idea is you need to have it damp, but you don't want it overly wet, and you certainly don't want it too dry. And then food. Remember that the little microorganisms that are doing the job in making all those materials into compost need to be fed, and they need to be fed a balanced diet. Now, I enjoy a big burger and French fries probably as much or more than most people. And a meal of that is pretty satisfying. But if that was what I ate 3 times a day, day in and day out, my health is going to go down, and it's not going to be a good thing. But if I had a balanced diet 3 times a day, I'm going to be able to thrive. Same with your pile. It needs to be well fed with a balanced diet, and more on that in a minute. So I talked about the carbon nitrogen ratio. It's basically how much carbohydrate or how much brown material is in your pile, stuff that's kind of the food, the ratio of that to how much nitrogen is available. Nitrogen being a fertilizer, not just for plants, but also something that's available for other microfauna or the small critters, not just the plants. They need to have nitrogen too. And if this gets out of balance too much, especially if you have a high carbon nitrogen ratio, your pile probably isn't going to thrive. Don't get too hung up on the numbers, but for those of you that might want to know a little more detail, here's some idea of what that carbon nitrogen ratio looks like for common material that you might put into your pile. Clearly, if you were up here and this is all you did, you're going to be out of whack because you don't have this 30-to-1. Your carbon, you have too much carbon. As you get down into here, if you have good balance of that kind of ratio, your pile is going to do really well. Down here, you can compost down here, but your pile is going to collapse pretty quickly. It's going to get hot, and then it's going to just decompose very quickly, and you're going to end up not with a lot of bulky stuff. It's going to end up very small. So that was the technical end of things. I'm going to keep it simpler. Here's a really nice resource that I found from Oregon State, where think about it in terms of 1 part green stuff. That would be your nitrogen. That would be your plant, your grass clippings or your leaves or something of that sort. 4 parts of your brown stuff, that might be hay, could be paper, shredded paper, that type of thing. So 1 part green, 4 parts brown, then you add air and water.
You reached out to U.S. Surgeon General.
So think about this: 1 + 4 = compost. So that, even though you've got this stool, I could be out and I could have plenty of air, I could have all the food I need, and I could have all the water I needed. But if my habitat wasn't good, I'm not going to thrive out there. Similarly with your compost pile, if it doesn't have the right habitat, then it's not going to thrive. Now, what do I mean by that? Rule of thumb, they say that you need 1 cubic yard equivalent of material to really get a critical mass of material that's going to do what you want it to do. If you have something that's smaller, you're going to have probably too much surface area that's going to dry out and not have, and it's going to expend its heat out into the atmosphere. As you get a bigger pile, then it's not going to dry out quickly, and then the outer pile is going to insulate the inner pile, and it's going to get hot. And when I'm talking hot, I'm talking, it's not uncommon to have 140, and if you're really cooking, so to speak, you can have 150 going on 160. So be thinking, if you can, a cubic yard of material is going to be optimal. It'll happen smaller than that, but maybe not as quickly, and you'll probably need to turn it because you're going to have things on the outside that are not getting hot, and you'll want to take that and move it into the inside of your pile. Plus, now I'm going to talk about compost bins and containers, that type of thing, because it makes it easier to contain and maintain your cubic yard of material. There's a lot of things out there that you can use. And here's some commercial, and I think this is kind of a homemade thing made from PVC and 2x4 and a 30-gallon plastic barrel. So there's different things that you can use that are commercially available, and they all work. And if you don't have the ability of expanding into a utility yard, as I do, you may need one of these just to keep things smaller and less scattered about. My choice, because I have the room and it's worked over the years, is to have a 3-bin system made up of pallets. And I was able to get shipping pallets for free. And I've got a pallet coming out here, 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 and here. So there's 4. And then a pallet in the back here, here, and here. So they're about 50 inches high, a little bit, 40 feet to 50 inches high, and about the same back and forth this way and out this way. So clearly bigger than a cubic yard. Then I like to use cinder blocks because I can build up and take down according to the needs that I have. I may want to be into this pile, so I can remove this wall, and I may need to build up this pile so I can take these and move them over. But cinder blocks have worked. I have hinges on plywood, so I can raise and lower plywood to keep too much rain from going in. And I've had an evolutionary process. I have used hay bales before, and they certainly work. They decompose, which is good, but also bad because you lose your front wall, and they get heavy and difficult to move around. So I've done the bit with just a plain pile. We've done the bit with store-bought 1x6 cedar, and what I've ended up with for now is these pallets. And I'm on my 6th season, and I'm going to be lucky to get through this winter because they are rotting, but remember, free was a very good price, and I'll just replace them. I want to talk about tools. It's your choice, but here's what works for me. As you're out and about in your yard, clearly a rake is handy, or a leaf blower, and then a pitchfork. I'd trade this in for almost anything else as my first choice for composting. It's handy for picking up things out in your yard, but it's really good for turning your pile, much better than a shovel. But as you get down to the bottom of your pile, having a shovel to get it off of the ground is helpful. We talked about water. A hose and a nozzle is paramount. And then if pitchfork wasn't the first choice, a compost thermometer would be my first choice. This little gem will tell you just what's happening inside your pile. It has a probe on it that's probably about 24 inches long, so you can stick that into your pile and tell exactly how warm it is. And warmth will be a really good surrogate for how effective your composting process is going. Another thing that's very helpful is to have a good wheelbarrow to bring material into your composting area and to move your compost back out into your gardens. This is optional, but this is a little framework made out of fencing material and 1/2 inch hardware cloth or 1/2 inch wire screen. And it's helpful for sifting your compost pile. So this is what it looked like. I put it on top of my wheelbarrow, and then you're a little bit like an archaeologist, scraping or sifting this material down, and you end up with some really, really nice stuff. You end up with some stuff that doesn't go through. So you've got Douglas fir cones for us, an eggshell here, the top of a pumpkin, and a rock, and just some coarser material. Here you have the choice of tossing out some stuff that probably isn't going to decompose very well or at all for you. I don't know how, it doesn't matter how hot your pile is, you're not going to be able to melt that rock into compost. So that goes out back into the driveway. But clearly the eggshell and some of this other material, I just dump right back into the pile. And here again, this is what you're left with. This is black gold. And this could be left to even decompose a little bit more, but this is clearly something that's useful in your garden as an amendment or in your beds as a top mulch. And I don't know what the going price is for this type of thing now, but this was quote unquote free, so worked out really well. I like my mulching lawnmower. So I use it with my catcher and I use it without my catcher. Last fall, here's a maple tree with leaves on the grass. And in 10 minutes, going around underneath this tree, I cleaned up the yard and I got some really nice stuff to put into my compost. And I got a pretty decent mix of grass and leaves that are beginning to get chopped up at this point. And then if everything works well, I'm going to show you real quickly a short film clip. But here are some, this doesn't work well if the leaves are very wet. I can tell you, it just gums up and it stalls your lawnmower. But if the leaves are at all dry, you can do some amazing things with your mulching lawnmower. So this is that after running over it with the lawnmower. And we'll just see if we can get this to work. Okay. So it was quite a deal to take that and reduce it to that and add it to the compost. And that's what these piles are here, is those mulch leaves. Okay, so we've got our material. What do? You just get ready and you do it. Now you could get pretty technical and you could go back and say, well, this stuff was 120 to 1, this stuff was 30 to 1, and you could get mathematical and figure out exactly what you needed to get your 30 to 1 ratio. You know, when you're out there, if you use this basic thought process and you use your thermometer, you keep things wet and you keep things turned, things are going to happen and you're going to be happy. Here's a pile that Kathy and I were building last October with the material that was out in the yard.
Brian, just a second. You're still, the picture showing is the video frame. We haven't advanced on to the other pictures.
Well, how about that? Let's see if I can. Thank you for that. We're going to see if we can get back here. All right.
We see it, you're good.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. So anyway, we basically composed the pile, and in the first day, we stuck the thermometer in the pile and it was 55 degrees. This was Wednesday at 3:40. The second day, not quite 24 hours later, it's warming up and we've got it up to 84. On the fourth day, it jumped to 132. Things are starting to happen. And it stayed there for some time, but then we started to see it drop. And we go, it's dropping. What's going on? Well, if we think about these four things, if we think about air, food, water, and habitat or volume, something's going on here. I know that there's still plenty of food there, and the carbon and nitrogen ratio was okay. The pile was still moist. There's two things that mainly, the big thing that was probably happening is the volume of the pile started to go down as things started to settle. It was still pretty sizable, but as it settled, we probably lost that air component inside the pile, and it probably needed to be turned or fluffed up at that point, which is what we did. And it popped back up and stayed hot. And 25 days later, this is what we ended up with. It was pretty nice stuff. It's still kind of coarse. You could use this if you wanted to, especially if you sifted it, but it turned into black gold. And these aren't red wigglers, but the earthworms that migrated into the pile were quite happy, and they did some work on their own out there too. I ended up covering this pile and utilizing it this spring, so about 6 months later, and it worked out really, really nicely. In fact, here it is as a top mulch on some primroses, and here it is as a soil amendment in a raised bed where we grew some onions. And this is the first year that Kathy and I really successfully grew some nice onions. Now, it wasn't just because of the compost. We did some other management of those onions as well. but it turned out very, very nicely. So pretty much to the end of the presentation, I hope that I've answered why bother to compost, and I hope that I've helped to answer how do I compost. Clearly, there's lots of material out there, and I'd encourage you to dive into it more. The science, the biology of what's going on is really intriguing, and it helps you to then do some troubleshooting if something happens and you don't have the results that you'd like to with your pile. But in the end, you get happy. Here's my wife, Kathy, and our first granddaughter about 5 or 6 years ago, playing in the garden. And clearly they're having a good time, and they've got some good things happening in the background. So I think that's it. And I'll try to answer your questions. And I know that there's other people that are on that can help with answering questions as well.